Is that Krystal COF?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Krystal, and I'm going to start off with a quote as well. 18th century Judge William Blackstone once said, "It is better than 10 guilty persons escape than one innocent suffer." Such a statement should hold true to today's American justice system, but unfortunately it does not. Despite America's innocent until proven guilty legal system, there are still numerous individuals who are wrongfully convicted and put to death under capital punishment. In doing so, the government blindly maintains this idea of an eye for an eye, while failing to see the death penalty is actually an outdated and malfunctioning aspect of the justice system. Today I will advance my proposition that the death penalty has a significant negative impact on our society. I will do so by first showing that the death penalty negatively affects our court systems. Then I will proceed to show you that the cost of the death penalty negatively affects our society. Next, I will show how the death penalty is racially biased. And lastly, I will evidence how the death penalty fails to deter crime. Let's begin first by looking at how the death penalty negatively affects our court systems. As mentioned earlier, the system is subject to putting an innocent person to death. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, in one disturbingly recent case, a prisoner was proven innocent just 48 hours from his execution. We can also, in another more particular study, Samuel Grass, a law professor at the University of Michigan Law School and a former criminal defense lawyer, gathered data from the U.S. Department of Justice on all 7,482 death sentences in the U.S. from 1973 to 2004, and found that 4.1% of defendants were likely falsely convicted. We can also turn to real-life individual examples to show the reality of convicting an innocent person to death. Let's look at the example of Cameron William. In 1992, he was convicted of arson murder in Texas. He was believed to have intentionally set a fire to kill his kids. In 2004, he was put to death. But unfortunately, the Texas Forensic Science Commission later found that the evidence was invalid and concluded that the evidence used against him was invalid. And as it turns out, the fire was really accidental. Another way that the death penalty has a negative impact on the court systems is that the endless appeals and required additional procedures clog up the court. The U.S. goes to extreme measures before allowing someone to be sentenced to death. All the appeals, the motions, the briefs take up a lot of time of the judges, the attorneys, the employees, the courtrooms, and all the facilities. And this time and space can be used to resolve other matters. As a result of this, the prosecutors are forced to ignore misdemeanors and misdemeanor violations and pursue more serious crimes. The judges, for example, also delay their trials, and in some cases, those charged with violent crimes are let go because the caseloads are too heavy. Now let's move on to the second point, and it is that the high cost of the death penalty has a negative effect on society. Contrary to the popular belief that the death penalty is more expensive than life without parole, it is not. The death penalty is way more expensive than life without parole because the Constitution requires a long and complex judicial process for capital sentences. For example, in Tennessee, the death penalty trials cost an average of 48% more than the average cost of trials in which prosecutors seek life imprisonment. In California, the system costs $137 million per year. It would only cost $11.5 million for a system without the death penalty. The greatest costs associated with the death penalty occur prior and after the trial. Because more investigations are needed for capital cases, and special motions and extra times for conviction, extra time for jury selection are typically needed. When the death penalty results in a verdict less than death, the taxpayers are the first who have to pay. And they also have to pay for the pretrial, and the trial also have to pay for incarcerating the prisoner for a lifetime. Lastly, the death penalty diverts the resources from effective crime controls. So the money that's used for the death penalty could have been going to resources such as crime prevention, mental health treatments, education, rehabilitation, and drug treatment programs. Now that we've established how the cost of the death penalty is a negative aspect in society, we're going to move on to how the death penalty is racially biased. We have established how, in a 1990 report from the General Accounting Office, 82% of studies show that the victim was the race of the victim influences whether the person is sent to death. There's either a pattern of victim or race defendant discrimination. In this particular study, the authors reviewed all homicides that occurred in California from 1990 to 1999, using records from the FBI. And 302 death sentences were returned. The study finds that the race, the ethnicity, and the community diversity are key factors in determining who gets put to death in this country. Yet in another study, in 2007, the American Bar Association concluded that 1/3 of African American death inmates in Philadelphia would have received sentences of life imprisonment if they had not been African Americans. So this isn't just something of the past, it still happens today. And lastly, we're going to move to the point that death penalty fails to deter crime. And the vast majority of law improvement and criminologists believe that the death penalty fails to deter crime. According to a new study published by Professor Michael Radlett, Chair of Sociology at the University of Colorado, the deterrence does not work. The death penalty does not work to deter crime. He says that the top criminologists in the country believe that the hypothesis of deterrence is actually just a myth. For the person not to convict a crime, they have to think about the consequences, but most people don't think about that. They're either intoxicated, they're either doing drugs, they're either very frustrated, or they're just not thinking right. So in conclusion, I hope you all think about the information presented to you today, and I hope that I convinced you that there is the death penalty gives society a negative effect.
All right, Krystal, the proposition's clearly identified at the beginning. I do think that you have a long, persuasive speech that you get into before you actually get to the argument, and I think that the idea of trying to have it both ways is maybe extending the concept of the assignment a little bit too much here. And since you're going over time, that probably could have been condensed, and there are a whole bunch of presuppositions in that you're never going to get time to support. So it's better to stick to the arguments that you have developed and you have evidence on, instead of trying to kind of lead us into those arguments through this other path. When you gave us the proposition, though, it was very clear, and the secondary points were nicely laid out. I don't think there's any doubt that there's controversy on the subject, so that's pretty straightforward. The signposts are okay, except that on the first point, it sounded to me like you had gotten to a second point, but it turns out that it's really an extension of that first point, and it wasn't quite clear how it was related to that first point, so there's a little bit of confusion there. But after that, I thought you distinguished the supporting points as you went through the speech pretty effectively. The deliveries, by the way, I think you're rushing a little bit. I know because you've got a lot of information that you have to go a little bit quicker, but sometimes you need to explain some concepts. The first section where you've got data on innocent people being executed, there's one example that you use, and I thought that one was pretty effective. I do think you want to give us a little bit. You did have the source citation on the evaluation of the data after the execution. This is the fire issue, and I thought that was good, but it did sound like you were paraphrasing some of the conclusions, and you want direct quotes there. The ACLU example that you have at the beginning is conclusionary. I don't know what they're referring to. You do have a study that talks about and it tries to estimate the number of people who might have been wrongly convicted and executed. I think that you need a little bit more data on that. You kind of explain what the conclusion of the study is. there's a little bit of inconsistency between the first and the second points, because on the first point you're saying innocent people are being executed. On the second point you're saying we're taking up all this time trying to make sure that innocent people don't get convicted, and that seems a little bit strange to me. So should our priority be on making sure the innocent are protected, or should it be on saving money? I think that there's a reasonable question that might be asked by the person who's responding on this particular point. On the cost issue, for instance, the one piece of data that you had when it came to money was that California spends $130 some odd million in order to have the death penalty. If we didn't have that, we'd only be spending the equivalent of $11 million on that. So it seems like it's $120 million, which would be good for you and me. I think we'd accept that if it was a lotto ticket. But the state of California, I'm not exactly sure is going to go broke because they're spending that extra $120 million. If you could show that that's a little bit more significant, I think that would be fine. Here's where there's a problem. You've got this whole section where you make a whole bunch of assertions about how judges and lawyers and prosecutors, they don't have time to go after these other cases, and there's no data on that at all. So I thought that that was probably the weakest part of the argument. I like the evidence that you had on the first point about the innocent being executed, but I thought that point was a little bit problematic. I know that you're trying to do a kind of rebuttal argument on the deterrence issue. It's not directly related to the proposition that you're presenting, and as a consequence, it's probably unnecessary, and 98% of that argument was what was making you overtime at the end of the speech. All right, thank you.